James Swanson is a lawyer and author of the Edgar Award-winning and New York Times best-selling Manhunt, the 12-day chase for Lincoln's killer. He's held a number of government and think tank posts in Washington, D.C., including at the United States Department of Justice, and serves on the Advisory Council of the Ford's Theater National Historic Site and the Advisory Committee of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission. He has written on various subjects for a variety of publications, including the Wall Street Journal, American Heritage, Smithsonian, and the Los Angeles Times. His other books include the acclaimed photographic history Lincoln's Assassins, Their Trial and Execution, as well as Chasing Lincoln's Killer, and adaptations of Manhunt and Bloody Times, The Funeral of Abraham Lincoln, and The Manhunt for Jefferson Davis for young readers. Mr. Swanson was born on Lincoln's birthday. And now for our treat, James Swanson.
Thank you, Joanne, for saying that I gave a good talk. But remember last time that was indoors, it was in the fall, and it wasn't 100 degrees out. I thought maybe I should get a Lincoln and Booth lookalike to come up on stage to keep you entertained. But thanks for coming on such a hot day. I'm going to talk about a couple things today that I almost never wrote about and didn't even think about writing about. When I wrote the book Manhunt, the 12-day chase for Lincoln's killer, I thought that was really going to be my piece on Lincoln and the Civil War and all the events coming out of the last weeks of the war in April 1865. That was always the book I wanted to write. I was born on Lincoln's birthday, as Joanne mentioned, and since I was a little boy, I visited the Lincoln sites. I got comic books and Lincoln trinkets and the kind of thing you'd buy for a child in the souvenir shop, and I'd visit the Lincoln deathbed, which is now on display at the Chicago Historical Society. And that's really how I got into the story. And when I was a little boy, I read Jim Bishop's The Day Lincoln Was Shot. I got the book 20 Days, that photo history. But all through those years, even though I built a personal library of several thousand books on Lincoln and the Civil War, I never found a book about the assassination and the chase for Booth that really satisfied me that I was reading the whole story. And so I wrote Manhunt because that was really the book I had always wanted to read when I was a kid or a young adult, but no one had ever written. And unbelievably, although there are 18,000 books about Abraham Lincoln, and maybe up to 1,000 of them have some relation or some coverage of the assassination or what happened next, no one had ever done a week by week, day by day, hour by hour, and sometimes minute by minute account of those days from April 14th, 1865 on. So that's how I ended up doing Manhunt. It's really a subject I had in my mind for a very long time. And I thought once I did it, and once I did the young adult version with Scholastic, the Harry Potter publisher, Chasing Lincoln's Killer, I thought I would move on to other subjects. But I put a little bit of the Lincoln funeral train in Manhunt. Very little, really just to contrast what was happening to John Wilkes Booth at that moment across the country. But as I started giving a lot of talks on the book, people would often ask, well, what happened next? Or wasn't there a big funeral for Lincoln? Or what happened to Jefferson Davis? And some of these questions I didn't have a very specific answer for. Of course, I knew that Davis had fled Richmond. I wasn't sure exactly why or what he did after he had escaped. And so I decided to do some research on the escape of Jefferson Davis and what happened to him when he left Richmond and he was on the run. And then I started thinking about, well, what happened to Abraham Lincoln? Because though he died on the morning of April 15th, less than 12 hours after he was shot, his journey wasn't done. Lincoln went on a 13-day funeral train that traveled almost 600 miles that took him back to Illinois. While that was happening, Jefferson Davis was on his train, or on horseback, or on wagon, or on foot, going on his final journey. And I became entranced by this image of the two presidents at the end of the Civil War, each bound on his final journey. And that started to interest me a lot. And as I read more, I came to the conclusion that the final journeys of Jefferson Davis and Abraham Lincoln, in part also the final journey of John Wilkes Booth, but the final journeys of Lincoln and Davis, to me, became two of the most important journeys ever in American history, along with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, the journey of Lewis and Clark, even the journey to the moon, because these final journeys of Lincoln and Davis really created myths and legends that influence us to this very day, how we think about the Civil War, how we remember the Civil War, how we remember the Union, how we remember the Confederacy. And so I decided to combine their final journeys into one book and see where that took me. Because I think Lincoln was certainly right. To use his words about the decisions of the Civil War affecting us down to the latest generation, I think what happened to Lincoln and Davis at the end of that war still influences us to the latest generation. It might seem odd writing a book about Lincoln and Davis because they would seem to have so little in common. It's tough to write a book about two people unless some of the threads cross each other. But I discovered as I was researching the book, Lincoln and Davis, though they seem quite different, you couldn't think of two more opposites, the leader of the Union, the leader of the Confederacy. Certainly had many differences, many key differences, but they have many strange and interesting and profound things in common. So before we get to Booth, I thought I'd mention a little about Lincoln and Davis and what I found so different and so similar in each of them. They were both born in Kentucky, less than 100 miles apart and less than 1 year apart. So they're from the same region, subject to a lot of the same influences. As young boys, they were involved in physical things. Lincoln became a legendary wrestler, and at age 9, he had a rail-splitting axe put in his hand. And from his youth, Abraham Lincoln worked as hard physically as the majority of American slaves had to work on plantations. Maybe not as hard as the slaves in the rice fields, which was brutal work. But Lincoln's father really treated him like his personal servant or slave. He collected the wages that Lincoln earned. And so that was Lincoln as a young man. Jefferson Davis, as a boy, learned to wrestle from slaves. Davis grew up with privilege. His father sent him to elite schools. His older brother became his most important mentor. And Jefferson Davis went to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He became a hero in the Mexican War, where he left his seat in Congress and he raised the Mississippi Rifles. And in a legendary battle, his unit was charged by Mexican lancers. And it might sound almost comical now, defending against a charge of men on horseback with lances. But in the 1830s and 1840s, Mexican lancers were among the most dangerous forms of cavalry in the world. Napoleon's army, with his Polish lancers, had proved how deadly lancers could be. And much of the legend of the creation of the Colt revolver is around the idea that you needed a pistol with huge stopping power that could stop a Mexican lancer riding at full speed towards you. So Davis ordered this unique formation of a V shape. The Mexicans rode into it. He broke their charge. He was wounded. He refused to leave the field. He came home to great glory, became a senator, was one of our best secretaries of war ever. One of the odd legacies of Davis is the U.S. Camel Corps. I recognize some of you in the audience, and I know you're big military history buffs, so you know that the War Department once bought a number of camels and tried to use them as a substitute for horses in our western deserts. It ultimately didn't work out. A lot of the camels were just let go, and for years later you could see a solitary camel roaming the American West until it was eaten by animals or killed by Indians. Davis became a spokesman for an entire region of the country, the great agricultural empire of the South. He loved the North, though. He traveled north often. He gave speeches in New England. He liked visiting there. He once said in a speech, "With our great agriculture and your great industry, we shall conquer this continent." He had physically, personally, gone on journeys a couple thousand miles long across the country in snow and ice, hot desert temperatures. He was a man who had seen with his own eyes the great expanse of the American territory, and was very much a nationalist. And as it turned out later, Jefferson was against secession. He didn't want to be president of the Confederacy. He didn't campaign for it. He thought the Southern hotheads were mistaken to try to leave the Union. So in a nutshell, that's Jefferson Davis. Certainly, by the time of the 1850s, a number of people would have assumed that one day Jefferson Davis would be a future president of the United States. And I suspect that in 1860, if the Democratic Party had not divided, and you didn't have John Bell running, John C. Breckinridge running, and Stephen A. Douglas running, two of them Democrats, one the National Union Party, and then Abraham Lincoln as the Republican. I wonder what would have happened if the election was simply Democrat Jefferson Davis versus Abraham Lincoln Republican. I think there's a reasonable chance that Jefferson Davis would have been elected president of the United States in 1860. After all, Lincoln got only 39.8% of the popular vote against those other candidates. You know, we talk about Bush v. Gore and how some of us are shocked that someone could be president by not getting the majority of the votes of the American people. Well, Abraham Lincoln got 39.8% of the votes of the American people, and yet he became president. Lincoln had a different path in life. He had no sponsors, no wealth, no privilege, less than 1 year of formal schooling. Lincoln said, "You can describe my origins as the short and simple annals of the poor." Lincoln did not get along with his father at all. He opposed Lincoln's interest in scholarship and reading. And so he had no propulsion from his home like Jefferson Davis did to do great things in the world. But Lincoln did have an X factor that drove him to rise. He wanted to be better than his origins. His work ethic was incredible. Once a young man wanted to go to law school and be a lawyer, and he asked for Lincoln's secret. And Lincoln said, "There is no secret. The answer is get the books and read and work, work, work." He had an unquenchable work ethic to rise and make himself better. Unlike Jefferson Davis, Abraham Lincoln was essentially a nobody for much of his life. When Davis was going to West Point, Lincoln was working at a country store in New Salem, Illinois, not making much at all. When Davis was a war hero, Lincoln was a one-term congressman from Illinois who opposed the Mexican War and demanded that President Polk reveal where the hostilities really began between Mexico and the United States. Lincoln, in some resolutions in Congress, demanded to know the exact spot on which the first hostilities occurred. Back home, Lincoln was ridiculed as Spotty Lincoln, and even shown as an animal with spots on him in cartoons, because Lincoln was thought to be unpatriotic by questioning the president on the validity of the origins of the Mexican War. So Davis is a hero in battle. Lincoln is saying we shouldn't even be fighting this war. When Davis has national fame, Abraham Lincoln is really an anonymous circuit-riding country lawyer in Illinois. Half of Lincoln's law practice was collections work, debt collection. He did everything on the frontier. Murder, theft, cattle theft, home invasions, robbery, defamation, lawsuits. Lincoln handled it all. He had no national reputation whatsoever in the 1840s, the way Davis did. Lincoln administered nothing larger than his 2 or 3 man law office. And it's true, Lincoln did carry papers around in his top hat. And he did have a folder. Even as president, he had a folder that said, if you can't find it anywhere else, look in here. I've seen a note written by Lincoln to one of his male secretaries that said, a few days ago, I had papers on my desk pertaining to the case of XYZ. I've searched my entire office. I can't find anything. Help me. So Davis is administering the War Department. Lincoln has difficulty managing the paperwork of a two-man small-town law office in Springfield, Illinois. If in 1855, maybe even 1856, 57, before the great Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, yeah, let's say early 1858, if you had said to the majority of Americans, who's more likely to be a future president of the United States? Jefferson Davis of Mississippi or Abraham Lincoln of Illinois? The first question you might have been asked is, who's Abraham Lincoln? He simply was not a great national name prior to those debates and prior to his run for the presidency. So, here they are, elected by their people, coming to their respective national capitals, Davis first in Montgomery, Alabama, Lincoln in Washington. Davis is certainly more up to the task than Abraham Lincoln is. He's been a military officer, the military academy, he fought in a war. Lincoln was weak militarily as president his first year and a half. He had many uncertainties, and he admitted it. So Davis certainly was the superior military commander or visionary than Abraham Lincoln. They were also, well, I'll get to the most important things in common during the war. They were despised by certain percentages of their own people. Davis was bedeviled by generals and cabinet secretaries who hated him, who resented him. They wanted the power. They wanted the authority. They didn't want to let the president of the Confederacy use their state resources. The great conundrum of the Confederacy was the states seceded partly in the name of states' rights and independence, but the only possible way the South could win that war was to submit state authority to the central authority of the Confederate States government under Jefferson Davis. We don't want our uniforms from Georgia being shipped to Virginia. Those muskets were made in North Carolina. Why are they being sent to Mississippi? Davis was constantly tortured by some of his own generals and his cabinet secretaries, as was Abraham Lincoln. Seward thought he could be deputy president or Lincoln's prime minister. Salmon P. Chase, his Treasury Secretary, was plotting against Lincoln and even wanted to run against him for the presidency. Lincoln got rid of him and put him on the Supreme Court. But they had to watch their backside, their own people. Disloyalty in New York City, Ohio, Indiana for Lincoln. Davis, it could crop up anywhere. Some remote parts of the South were never for secession. They really didn't want to fight with the Confederacy. So each leader had many problems on his own side. So here they are when the capital goes to Richmond. Just like when they were born, they're less than 100 miles apart, laying their heads on their pillow each night, trying to figure out the way to defeat the other's empire. They did have a terrible thing in common during the Civil War. In 1862, Lincoln's favorite son, Willie, died in the White House after an illness of about 3 weeks. And Abraham Lincoln was devastated. I'm convinced, after reading all of Lincoln's letters, reading all of his speeches, and reading much about him, Abraham Lincoln would say that the worst thing that ever happened to him, aside from being assassinated, of course, the worst thing that ever happened to him was to lose that boy. He moved like Lincoln, he thought like him, he talked like him. None of the other sons were as close to their father as Willie was to Abraham. Jefferson Davis was at his office in 1864 at the Customs House. The White House of the Confederacy was really not the same as the White House in Washington. Davis maintained a separate office at the old Federal Customs House. He had a private office in the Confederate White House. He was summoned home. Come home as quick as you can. One of his sons had fallen from a second-floor balcony and had crushed his chest, had a head injury. Davis rushed home, held his boy in his arms, only long enough to watch him die. Later that night, Mrs. Chestnut writes, you could hear the footsteps of Davis creaking the floorboards on the second floor of the White House of the Confederacy as all the elite in Richmond came to call on him, and he couldn't bear to see the people. He paced the second floor through much of the night. Strangely enough, Lincoln buried his son Willie temporarily at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown. Charles Carroll, the clerk of the Supreme Court, had a family vault with several crypt holes in it for coffins, and Willie Lincoln was laid to rest there temporarily, less than 100 feet from a grave where one of Jefferson Davis's sons had been buried in the 1850s when Davis was serving in Washington. That's really one of the things that got me to write this book. When I visited that cemetery and I discovered through research where that grave of the Davis boy was and how close it was to the temporary grave of Lincoln's son. It just seems so odd and also moving. And of course, the death of Willie sent Lincoln back to the 1830s, to the death of Anne Rutledge, a young woman in New Salem, Illinois. Now, for more than 150 years, Mary Lincoln's loyalists and apologists have, I believe, concealed the true nature of the relationship between Abraham Lincoln and Anne Rutledge back in New Salem. In fact, I recommend that you read the magnificent Abraham Lincoln biography by Michael Burlingame for the full truth about who Mary Lincoln was and for more truth about New Salem. Lincoln was devastated by the death of this young woman. His friends confiscated his razor blades because they feared he would commit suicide over her death from illness. He was sometimes found collapsed upon her grave, mourning for the loss of her. The villagers knew what was going on. They saw the long walks they had, the conversations. Anne Rutledge was illiterate. We have no photograph of her. It was too early for photography in Illinois. And who would think to paint a portrait or draw a sketch of a simple illiterate girl on the Illinois frontier? One thing does survive that links them, aside from historical memory, is a book at the Library of Congress, a book of grammar. And Abraham Lincoln has inscribed on the title page, Anne Rutledge is learning to read. He was teaching her. All we know about her appearance is that one of her brothers said 30 years later to one of Lincoln's law partners, she was fair and had blue eyes. Strangely, there's also a parallel to Davis. Davis had met a girl named Sarah Knox Taylor, the daughter of General Zachary Taylor. Sarah, who went by the name Knox, fell in love with Jeff. Her parents opposed the marriage, not because they had a particular dislike for Jefferson Davis, but because they did not, we think, want their daughter to live the tough life of an army officer's wife on the western frontier. They corresponded for 2 years. Jeff resigned from the army so they could marry. They did, and he took her on her honeymoon on a trip down to the Mississippi River to visit his family. They went to his sister's plantation, and there Jeff and Knox were afflicted with a very virulent form of malaria brought over by slaves 2 centuries earlier. They both almost died. Jeff recovered enough from his delirium to stagger to her bed, where in delirium she was singing his favorite song. So he took his bride in his arms, and she died. They'd been married for 12 weeks. Davis then went into what he called my great seclusion. So for the next 7 years, he really left the world behind and stayed on his plantation with his brother, his books, his slaves, his overseer. Davis had hired a black man to be his overseer, and he became one of Davis's closest friends and trusted advisors. Only later did he come out into the world when his brother decided that the mourning period was enough, and Jeff was introduced to Verena Howell, an 18-year-old daughter of a fine Virginia family. the letter exists, I think, from the day they met. And Verena writes to her mother, "Mother, he is almost as old as you are. But," and he also seems certain about everything he says. The certainty he has in his opinions offends me. And then she adds, "But there is something about him." And they married, had several children. And Jefferson Davis was blessed with a happy home life that most of us think Abraham Lincoln never enjoyed with the mercurial and bizarre Mary Todd. But that's another book and another story. And so I just find it interesting that both these men come to their capitals, presidents of their warring nations. They even looked alike, physically. They were tall, thin, scrawny men, not interested in fine food and furniture and equipage and dressing. They were absolutely unlike George Washington and unlike Thomas Jefferson, who couldn't buy enough clothing and rare books and fine furniture and the best in wine, the best in food. Lincoln and Davis didn't care about those things. They were much more men of the mind. They were very rational and cool-headed. They weren't temperamental. They didn't come to decisions quickly or in anger. They had, in the end, one great profound similarity and one great difference. And these two things, I think, more than anything about the two of them, contributed to the tragedy of the Civil War. They were highly principled men who, once they adopted a position that they thought was correct, would almost never give it up, almost never change their minds. Here's one of the Lincoln myths. Kindly Father Abraham, who always looked to compromise, who always wanted to get along with people. When politicians today say, let's be like Lincoln, let's compromise, they have no understanding of the true Abraham Lincoln whatsoever. The real Abraham Lincoln, and I say this not to disparage him, but just to state a fact, Abraham Lincoln, along with Jefferson Davis, are two of the greatest killers in American history. Abraham Lincoln was willing to send to their deaths over 620,000 people. The latest research from the experts on Civil War casualties suggests that the true losses might have been as high as 750,000. We'll never know. Lincoln would have sent 1 million, 2 million people to die to win that war. He would have never given up. He believed he was right. He believed he was vindicating the principles of free elections, as in, if you participate in a presidential election, you cannot withdraw from the Union just because you lost. Ultimately, he came to believe that he was vindicating the principle that slavery is wrong and somehow must end. Lincoln was asked about compromise on more than one occasion during the Civil War. At one point he said, having begun by war, let the issue be decided by war. Jefferson Davis was equally certain he was right. He would have fought to the end. He tried to fight to the very end. I'll get to a moment what he did at the end. He once said, as long as there is one man who will follow me, I will lead this cause. And you'll find it interesting what he was trying to do and what he was not trying to do when he escaped Richmond. So we have these two men who believe they're right and believe it's worth the lives of hundreds of thousands of their fellow citizens, hundreds of millions of dollars of crops, of shipping, of real estate, of property. Lincoln and Davis never met. The closest Lincoln came was in February '65 when the Confederate Vice President, Alexander Stephens, who Lincoln liked very much when they served in Congress together, met with Lincoln in the River Queen ship to paddle boat to talk about a settlement. People sometimes say, well, if Lincoln and Davis had been friends from the old days, would they have averted the war? Would they have gotten along? I don't think so. They overlapped for about 9 months in Washington in the late 1840s. Lincoln would have been out of Jefferson Davis's league. Davis and his wife had a great salon and a townhouse. They were one of the celebrated couples of Washington. Lincoln was a nobody from Southern Illinois. I think if they had met, they would have been baffled by each other, and they certainly would have been inflexible. That's the great thing they had in common that I think made settlement of the war almost impossible. Here's another thing, the great difference between them that made it impossible for them to have a settlement. Lincoln said it often, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. Lincoln once said, so I would not be a slave, I would not be a master. Lincoln once said, if the Southerners say slavery is so good for the slaves, I've never seen a white man volunteering to be a slave. Lincoln did not believe in equality, ever. That's one way we get Lincoln wrong today. He did not believe in equality. He believed in equal rights. He believed in equal opportunity. Jefferson Davis believed the opposite. Jefferson Davis believed that the white man was the superior race. Jefferson Davis believed that slavery was good for the enslaved people, that it had helped civilize the people who had come from Africa. Jefferson Davis never believed that blacks should ever have the right to vote the way Abraham Lincoln proposed at the end of his life. So these are these two men in April 1865. It's March, the war is coming to an end. Lincoln takes to his army in the field. He wants to be with them at the end. He goes to visit Grant, he visits the battlefields. Davis is still in Richmond, but by April 2nd, the position is untenable. Word comes from Lee, you must leave the city now. Davis doesn't want to believe him, but Lee says, no, I really mean it. Now, the city will fall. So Davis escapes on a train with his cabinet, with documents from the government in an orderly fashion, because Davis is not fleeing to save his own life. He's fleeing because he wants to save the Confederacy. He thinks he could keep going south, first to Danville, then, if necessary, abandon Virginia, then get into North Carolina, then, if necessary, abandon North Carolina to the Union and flee to South Carolina, then to Georgia, then west, then across the Mississippi to Kirby Smith and the Trans-Mississippi for a Western Confederacy. He leaves with several thousand men. During the escape, it dwindles to several thousand, several hundred, till a handful of men. He will not give up. He gives the Danville Declaration, with unconquered and unconquerable hearts, we will fight on. In the meantime, while Davis is on the run, Lincoln is not after him. Lincoln does not want to capture the Confederate leaders. He does not want to kill them. He doesn't want to have trials. Lincoln's attitude is just let him go. I don't want to know anything about Davis. Don't tell me the details. Just let him go. Of course, that all changes on the night of April 14th. Jefferson Davis doesn't find this out till several days later. Then the hunt becomes serious. He's named as a conspirator in the murder of Abraham Lincoln. He could be killed on sight. And so while Davis is on his final journey through the South, it becomes a farewell tour to the people of the South. He runs into a woman and a baby at a roadside, and the woman says, "He is named for you." Davis hands her his last gold coin and says, "Now he'll remember for whom he was named. Give it to the boy." His family's fleeing with him. They're together, they're not, they're meeting up, then they're separate. Lincoln is going home. A magnificent funeral in Washington, 100,000 people, becomes a secular saint overnight. As he goes from city to city, the funeral pageant gets more intense and more emotional. Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York City, Ohio, Indiana, Chicago, Springfield. Lincoln becomes an American saint during this 13-day period, while Jefferson Davis becomes an American devil, at least to the north. And also, by the way, to the people of North Carolina. If there are any North Carolinians here, you were not nice to Jefferson Davis when he fled through your state. In Greensboro, the citizens wouldn't let him spend the night in a home. They let others do it, but a northerner living in North Carolina let him stay. The South Carolinians in Davis's entourage says, "Mr. President, these North Carolinians are awful people. When you get to South Carolina, you'll be treated like a king." And he was. Ultimately, Davis ends up near Irwinville, Georgia on May 10th, 1865. Less than 30 men in his camp, his wife, his family, his top aides. Union cavalry rushes them at dawn, captures Davis, not dressed as a woman, not dressed in Verena's hoop skirt, not wearing a bonnet. He went to bed that night fully dressed in his... He was dressed as a Confederate general, but bare of insignia. His appearance bespoke his rank, so he wore no insignia. Gray frock coat, gray pants, knee-high, black leather riding boots, and a raincoat. That's where the legacies start to go in different directions. Lincoln is the great American hero. He suffered the martyrdom. He's assassinated at the climax of his victory. He's America's greatest political hero. Jefferson Davis is at his nadir. He's imprisoned at Fortress Monroe. He's shackled. He's humiliated. He thinks he's going to be executed at any moment. He's not put on trial. The Lincoln conspirators are tried and they're hanged, and most people think that might happen to Davis next. Then sober Northern voices say, "Don't kill him." One Republican newspaper says, "If we kill Jefferson Davis, 1 million Southern women will dip their handkerchiefs in his blood and fight us for another 100 years." In the North, there was a myth of how ferocious the Southern women were. A lot of Northerners thought the women of the South ran the show, and they were afraid of enraging the entire womanhood of the South by killing their hero. So Lincoln's legacy is secure. Davis is freed after 2 years. He doesn't know what to do. His plantations have been ruined. The slaves are gone. All his property has been stolen. And he believes he has to maintain an honorable attitude and not humiliate himself or do anything that would shame the Confederacy. He does not take the loyalty oath to the Union. He says, if we were right then, we are right now. And he viewed that that would be a betrayal of the Confederate dead if he would take a loyalty oath to the Union. Lee thinks he's going to write his memoirs, but dies suddenly in 1870. Davis writes to his chief aide, "Before I'm pulled into my grave, I shall write a history of our people." From that moment on, Davis devotes himself to the memories of the war. He writes articles, he does research, he encourages other Confederate leaders to correspond, to write books, to write articles. Davis essentially becomes the unofficial leader of the legend of the lost cause. Davis believes we may have lost on the battlefield, not for lack of valor or for lack of trying, but because we were simply outnumbered. And Davis believes we can win the war in the books. If we didn't win it on the field, we'll win it in the books, and we'll explain ourselves. So that's how he spends much of his life. And he starts to become a greater hero to the Southern people after the war than he ever was when he was president. The South's first love belonged to Lee, belonged to Stonewall, belonged to others, not Jeff Davis. The climax of Davis's post-war life is in 1886 when he's asked to go on a tour to dedicate the monument to the Alabama war dead. Davis believes that it's just another little trip. He's not in the best of health. But then he encounters people on the way. A Confederate soldier in uniform collapses at Davis's feet. An ex-slave of his falls to her knees and blesses him. A woman on a train says, "I'm more of a rebel today than I ever was." This is 1886, 21 years after the war. He goes, gives this speech. Tens of thousands of people are waiting for him. He's stunned. He's overcome with emotion. And he says, "I remember those boys. Their packs and their rifles weighed more than they did." He's talking about the teenage soldiers of the Confederacy at the end, the 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds. And Davis says, "I weep for those boys, a mother's tears. They were the seed corn of the South." And of course, what a metaphor that was, given that the South had been ravished, the crops had been destroyed. He was saying as our future, we lost our future when those boys died. Davis was sort of communicating directly now with the 240,000 Confederate dead. At that time, Confederate dead was often spelled with a capital C and a capital D, and there was a mystical feeling that the living Southerners owed allegiance to that vast host of the dead who were somehow watching over or hovering over the South. Davis goes on to give another speech, and the crowds are told, "Don't touch him, don't lift him up, you're going to kill him, he's so frail." And Davis says, "If I am to die, it would be a pleasure to die." And this is 21 years after the war. "It would be a pleasure to die in the presence of my Confederate army." Old veterans are there wearing uniforms. Old men touch him, and they begin trembling uncontrollably. They bring out a battle flag. Davis buries his face in it and begins to weep and says, "I'm like this old tattered flag." He then gives his final speech 6 months before he dies, and it's about the future. He says, "The past is dead. Let us bury our dead and look to a new future, North and South, one America." It's one of the most remarkable speeches he gives. Davis is now a great hero in the South. He dies. 300,000 people come to his funeral. Civil War veterans drag his monument down Monument Avenue. 7,000 children pull it on ropes and get it up. So his legacy, his followers believe, is secure. He's now a great American hero along with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln remains a great hero. John Wilkes Booth, a footnote in a way. He got two of the three things he wanted. He wanted vengeance against Lincoln. He wanted to prolong the Civil War, which he did slightly, I think. And he wanted to overturn the Emancipation Proclamation, which of course he did not. Oh, one other thing he wanted, he got it. Fame. If you go to Ford's Theater today, you'll see the city put up street banners with John Wilkes Booth image on it. Booth is one. We think of him as this antiquarian hero or anti-hero. We don't hate him the way we hate Lee Harvey Oswald or James Earl Ray. You go to the Lincoln Museum in Springfield, Illinois, the so-called Lincoln Museum, where they have wax figures on display of John Wilkes Booth. One as he's about to kill Lincoln. Now, you wouldn't go to the Martin Luther King Center and expect to see a figure of James Earl Ray or the Kennedy Library in Oswald. So Booth has tricked us in a way to not think of him as wrongfully as we should. His sister said it best in her memoir of him. She said he gave all that he had, life, honor, his talent, for a cause he held dear. Even now, strangers go to pile his grave with flowers. So we remember all these men today. Lincoln, certainly the future belonged to Lincoln. Slavery was wrong. It had to end. Jefferson Davis was a great American hero up till the Civil War. John Wilkes Booth, though, cannot be redeemed. An evil man, a murderer, a racist, a killer, who I think killed one of the greatest Americans of all time. I'll just say this at the time of the centennial. I was scheduled to give a talk about a year ago, and I was banned and my lecture was canceled because one of the hosts said that I was too sympathetic to Jefferson Davis because I humanized Jefferson Davis. And I'll just close by saying this. If you're going to understand anything about the Civil War, you've got to study the white soldiers and the black soldiers, the free men and the slaves, the women of the North, the women of the South. And you've got to study Abraham Lincoln and study Jefferson Davis, because if you're not willing to look at it all, you'll understand nothing about the Civil War. And so I just close by saying that it was a fun journey for me to go on to learn so much about Lincoln's myth and legend and Jefferson Davis. Certainly two of the most fascinating men in American history. And I think, according to this clock, there's about 10 to 12 minutes for questions. So if anyone would like to ask me anything, I'd be happy to answer.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear it? Stanton, in your books, he seemed to fill the power vacuum immediately after Lincoln was assassinated. He was very dictatorial, to say the least. They had a very odd relationship. Was there ever any information in your research that he was thinking about a coup almost from a military standpoint, where he would take over? And he obviously didn't have a lot of respect for Johnson.
If everyone didn't hear the question, it relates to Stanton and sort of filling the power vacuum, taking over after Lincoln died, and did Stanton have a coup in mind, or are there bad purposes? First, it's not true what was written in the 1930s by Otto Eisenschimmel. Stanton and Lincoln's cabinet was in no way involved in the murder of Lincoln. Stanton loved Lincoln. They didn't get along in the 1850s. They spent time at the soldiers' home together in their cottages. Lincoln once said, I'm paraphrasing now, Stanton is the shore upon which the waves of rebellion crash and are broken. Without Stanton, I could not live. And so you're right that as soon as Lincoln was killed, Stanton zipped right in. Andrew Johnson was a shadow figure after the assassination. But remember how it was seen then. The war wasn't over. Lincoln was the commander-in-chief. He had been murdered in the national capital, and most people believed, as it was, part of a conspiracy to kill other leaders. Booth was hoping to kill Grant. He sent a man to kill Andrew Johnson. And so Stanton viewed this as really a military situation. And so he took command of questioning the witnesses, sending out the troops and all that. But I don't see any evidence that Stanton ever thought he would take over. The worst Stanton ever did under Johnson was when he refused to vacate his office as Secretary of War, and he barricaded himself in his office. But then Grant tried to take care of Stanton by putting him on the Supreme Court when he became president, but unfortunately Stanton died. You can visit Stanton's grave at Oak Hill Cemetery in Georgetown in Washington, the same cemetery where Willie Lincoln was buried. It's a very moving memorial.
Hi. Was there any connection between Jefferson Davis and John Wilkes Booth?
Any connection between Jefferson Davis and John Wilkes Booth? None that I've seen. I'll preface that by saying many of the records of the Confederate Secret Service were lost or destroyed at the end of the Civil War, and we do know that Booth had contact with mid or lower level Confederate operatives in Canada and may have even gotten some money for them in Montreal. That's possible. After the assassination, 20 Confederate generals signed a letter to Grant, saying that we did not know about this, we do not believe in assassination, we would not countenance such a thing. I believe them. I don't believe the Confederate High Command was involved in Booth's plot. And after reading so much of Jefferson Davis and spending so much time with him, my personal conclusion, though he would have fought a civil war, though he thought slavery was right, I believe that Jefferson Davis would have thought it beneath his dignity and honor to order a man to be shot in the back in front of his wife. And I don't think that Jefferson Davis would have countenanced or participated in a plot to murder Abraham Lincoln. Davis was in church the morning he found out, and the Southern minister, gave a sermon that seemed to blame him. And Jefferson Davis laughed and said to his aides, "That minister sure seems to think that it was me." But Davis said, "This is really the worst possible thing for us. And while I have no special affection for Mr. Lincoln, I deplore what has happened." Anyone else?
Is it true that Davis gave Lee a directive to carry on a guerrilla war?
The question is, did Davis give Lee a directive to carry out a guerrilla war? I think not really. Davis was certainly more of a bitter ender than Lee. Lee sent him a letter, which he didn't get, that said, "Give up." And Davis said, no. Finally, all his aides had to say, "You've got to stop." And then Davis said, "Well, why are you with me?" And they said, "We're not with you to fight the war. We're here to die to save you. To save your family, your children, and your wife, and to save your life. We'll die before we let the Union take you and execute you. That's the only reason we're with you. We're not going to fight, but we'll fight to save your life." And it was at that moment, very late, that Davis realized all was lost. Now I've got to run for my life. The whole purpose of the 6-week escape was to save the Confederacy. There was talk, as long as there was one man who'll follow me, unconquered hearts, unconquerable hearts. You could read some of Davis's correspondence and statements to suggest he might have believed that we can fight that way. But I don't think, in the end, he came to that conclusion, and I don't think he gave the real order that said, fight on, no matter what, fight the guerrilla war.
Hi. I was wondering if you'd found anything in your research that Davis had sent or tried to send a peace talks force to Lincoln and he would not see them. In some of my research, I've read that somewhere, and I can't remember what the date was. I'm trying to back it up.
I don't have the exact details on that. There was concern that peace commissioners had been deputized by Davis to speak with Lincoln. I believe one of them was Campbell, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice. It is true that Lincoln believed it was inappropriate to meet with Confederate peace commissioners who would want to visit him in Washington. Lincoln certainly believed it wasn't even worth discussing unless they were going to discuss restoring what Lincoln often called their former relation to the Union. Lincoln certainly believed in unconditional surrender and the end of slavery. Whatever the details are about how that was stopped, or who said what to who, or what documents do or don't exist, Lincoln would have never engaged in substantive talks with any Confederate agent or operative, and that was unless it was based on an understanding that it was to surrender, to rejoin the Union, to end slavery. Certainly, that was made clear to Alexander Stephens in February 1865. So there was no real hope or chance. And of course, this was so late in the war. So many had died already. So much property and wealth had been lost. The great cost of the war had already been paid by the time there was even any suggestion that there might be peace talks. So I don't think it would have amounted to much.
I think that's all the time we have today.
Thank you.